Is physical media really dying, or has it just become a niche market? Well, today I'm going to get into what I believe are some common misconceptions about the current state of physical media, specifically as it relates to movies on 4K and Blu-ray. So let's rock this. Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Fuzz. When I first started thinking about covering this topic, I debated whether or not to even characterize this video as a back to basics installment, because it's really just me giving my opinion, my views on a topic that is often hotly debated in some circles, and that is over the issue of whether or not physical media is dead or is currently dying. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this really is a fundamental issue, because how one views the future of physical media can significantly impact their decision to either continue collecting or to even just start collecting to begin with if they're even thinking about getting into physical media. A lot of people simply aren't willing to invest in something if they're not sure if it's going to be around for much longer or if it's going to be obsolete in a few years. That's just human nature, and it's totally understandable. Now, interestingly enough, I haven't personally talked to or met very many collectors who actually do believe that physical media is dying out completely. I know there are some out there who do believe this, and that might even be the reason why they're collecting as aggressively as they are, because they're worried that these titles aren't going to be around much longer, and so they want to get everything they can while they still can. I get it. I totally get it. But it does seem like that sentiment and perception are more prevalent among our larger society in the streaming age, especially among those who are totally all in on streaming, or at least a lot more invested in streaming than they are in physical media. Let's face it, the masses are streaming out there, right? Physical media is no longer something that is for everyone, that's out there in the mainstream, it's become more of a niche. And people who primarily use streaming, they see nothing but streaming like all around them, and they assume that physical media is dead because they don't see very many people or know very many people themselves who actually use and collect physical media. So perception is a very powerful thing. It's easy to understand why some people might believe that physical media is dead or dying. So just to come right out and say it, no, I do not believe physical media is dying. Not even close. Now, I'll be the first to admit, look, I've got very strong opinions. You guys are probably starting to figure that out about me. I do have strong opinions, but in this case, I actually happen to believe my opinion is correct. I don't believe physical media is dying. I think it has become a niche market. I think that's what we're seeing. I think what's happening is physical media is changing and adapting and evolving, but it's most certainly not dying. We're always going to have collectors out there. And as long as we have collectors who are willing to pay, we're going to have physical media being produced and studios and labels rising to fill that demand. So I want to get into some analysis here and some evidence here that I think really supports my view on this, that physical media is not dying, it's just changing. Or has changed. Now, just a quick note here before I get into this. You're probably going to notice me looking down at my notes here on my laptop. I've got a lot of things that I wanted to go over here, and the notes just help me keep my thoughts organized and keep me on focus, right? So let's get into it. Now, first off, there are a couple key reasons, I believe there are a couple key reasons that people hold this view that physical media is dying. And I'd like to kind of address those reasons and offer my response to that. The first one is people tend to compare physical media sales now to what they were 20, 25 years ago before the streaming era ever came to be. I think that's a big mistake. Physical media is never going to have the same prominence or be what it once was back in the days when physical media was really the only game in town if you wanted to watch or own movies in the home. Now, sure, we had HBO and Showtime and other cable premium services, Cinemax and whatnot, but we didn't really have a whole lot in the way of on-demand back then. We didn't have streaming, and even on-demand wasn't really like a full thing like it is now, right? We had pay-per-view, for like wrestling or boxing events or concerts or something, but we didn't really have a significant on-demand infrastructure that is widespread throughout our society like we do now. That's just not the world we live in anymore. And I think we have to be careful using that kind of metric, sales now to what physical media sales were back then. Because essentially what we're talking about here is a popularity contest. We tend to do that a lot as a society, assume that things that aren't popular are dead somehow. But of course, that's not the way the world really works, is it? Just because something is not nearly as popular right now as it once was, that doesn't mean it's dead. And it certainly doesn't mean it's dying. It is, however, an indicator that physical media is changing or has changed. What we're seeing is physical media adapt to the world as it is now, rather than try to operate as if the world hasn't changed in the last 20 to 30 years, right? In terms of how people consume movies and media in the home. The vast majority of people out there are streaming. They're not using physical media. They're not buying discs anymore. And that's because physical media has become more niche, more collectible. It appeals to a more select group of people, right? A select group of cinephiles and film enthusiasts who love movies and want to have the best possible quality and experience in the home when they're watching the movies they love. It used to be for everyone, right? Physical media used to be something that was for the masses, right? That's what we did back in the 90s and the early 2000s and the late 80s too. We all used physical media back then. That was what everybody did, right? Because that was really the only option, short of taking a VHS tape and waiting for HBO or Showtime to air the movie that you want to see. Then you could pop it in your VCR recorder and record the movie. But of course, that's not retail quality. That's a bootleg. So really, yeah, if you wanted to have movies in the home, if you wanted to watch movies and own them, you had to use physical media. And here's why I think physical media has become more niche. Streaming, right? Streaming took physical media from being a mainstream thing that everybody did to making it a much more niche product. And it's because of the streaming era. I would argue that streaming has significantly devalued the arts in general, and made them much more disposable in people's eyes. And that's a sad state of affairs, really, when you think about it. At least I think it is. People simply aren't invested as much in films or music, for that matter. They're simply not as invested in the arts these days as they were back in the day. You know, at least not in the same way they were when physical media was king and totally mainstream. And people aren't as invested because streaming, let's face it, streaming offers a very different experience, right? Let's do a little thought exercise here and kind of roll through this. So what do we do when we're streaming, right? First of all, we scroll endlessly on the app, right? Trying to find a title we want. You know, you might find something that looks interesting. You click on it, you watch it for 5 minutes, and then you go, I'm not sure if I'm really digging this. And so you back out of it. You scroll some more and you find another title that sounds possibly interesting. You pop that on for 5 minutes and then you realize, that's not really doing it for me either. So you back out of it and you lather, rinse, repeat another 5 or 6 times until you finally find something that you can handle watching for more than 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And even then, your commitment to that viewing experience is still questionable, isn't it? Right? It might hold your attention for 10, 15, 20 minutes, but what happens? You get a half hour or 45 minutes into it and you're like, this isn't quite as good as I was hoping it would be. And then you still have that option to back out. Movies and music has become much more disposable in the modern era. And that's really, really unfortunate. Now compare that to what it was like back in the day in the 90s or early 2000s or late 80s, right? Back in the day, if you wanted to have a few movies to watch on a Friday or Saturday night, you'd actually have to physically go to another location to either rent or buy those movies, right? Because that's what we did. We went to the video rental stores when we wanted to watch something. So let's say you go to the video rental store, you're browsing through all the shelves, you're picking up the covers and looking at the art and reading the synopsis and whatever. You'd spend your time browsing and thoughtfully choose the movies that you wanted to watch that night, knowing that this was going to be your evening's entertainment. You couldn't just back out of the movie if you didn't like it after 5 minutes, right? Unless you wanted to take another trip to the video store. So you would thoughtfully choose a couple titles, pick them out, rent them, take them home, and then actually follow through with watching them, because you certainly didn't want to waste your rental fees, did you? So even if the film turned out to be something you weren't that into, the chances of you watching the whole thing were still much greater than they are now because you didn't want to waste that rental fee and have that money go to waste. People were a lot more invested in the movies they watched back then in the 90s and early 2000s. They're not nearly as invested anymore. Nowadays, the masses are streaming. Most people aren't collecting physical media anymore. So streaming has, in fact, made physical media more of a niche market. And comparing physical media sales now to the days when streaming wasn't even a factor is always going to be an apples to oranges comparison. It's a big mistake. You can't do that. The other factor that I think plays into people's perceptions about physical media is the decline in the presence of physical media units at brick-and-mortar retailers these days. It's been going down, right? I mean, we've been seeing physical media disappear from the stores. Best Buy, Target, Walmart, whatnot. Some retail outlets have significantly reduced their supply of physical media and their selection of physical media. And other retail locations and outlets have just gotten rid of physical media altogether because it just doesn't sell for them the way it used to. People assume that this means that physical media is dying. When they go to their Best Buy and they see the selection drastically reduced, or they go into their Target and they say, hey, where's all the physical media? It's gone now. People assume that means that physical media is dying. But I would argue they're not taking into consideration how many people, especially in the physical media collecting space, switched to online sales and online shopping a long time ago. I'm one of those people. As far as movies are concerned, I don't think I've largely stopped shopping at places like Best Buy or whatnot for movies like close to 10 years ago. As physical media has become more and more niche, online retailers have kind of stepped up to the plate and almost taken on an outsized role in servicing the demand for physical media. Now, personally, I noticed this trend with physical media probably 10 or 15 years ago, specifically as it pertains to music. I should back up a little bit here and kind of let you know a little bit about my own collecting history. When I first got into collecting 40 years ago, it was all about music. I started out as a compact disc, a CD collector, right? Or, well, technically it was cassette tapes before that, but really compact discs. In the late 80s, I started collecting CDs. I wasn't really even collecting movies yet at that time. I'm a big music guy. I'm a musician. Songwriter, sometimes recording artist. I've always been a big music guy, so I love music. And so, yeah, that's what I collected. I loved to collect the CDs of all my favorite artists back then. And that went on for quite a few years before I actually got into collecting movies. I didn't really get into collecting movies until DVD came along, and then I got a lot more interested in collecting movies at that point. And then eventually Blu-ray came along and I switched to that. I was maybe collecting Blu-rays for several years before I eventually took a hiatus from collecting anything at all. And I stopped collecting movies at that point for probably close to 10 years. I think I've mentioned this before in previous videos, but I stopped collecting movies for a long time. But during that time, I was still always collecting music. I was always still buying CDs. And what I noticed back 10 or 15 years ago is the places that I liked to go to buy music, they stopped carrying a lot of CDs and stuff that I liked. I used to shop at Circuit City. I always thought they had a really good selection back in the day. And, I have kind of weird tastes, right? The music I like, it's not necessarily the most mainstream music. I like a lot of progressive rock, bands like Rush and Yes and Genesis. And I like a lot of other kinds of stuff as well. But the point is, a lot of the stuff I liked was kind of harder to find anyway, but I used to go to Circuit City and be able to find all the things I wanted, or be able to find a lot of the things that I wanted there. And I noticed over time, over the course of a few years, that situation started to get worse and worse and worse. And eventually Circuit City stopped carrying CDs altogether. So when I got back into collecting movies after taking close to 10 years off, I assumed the same thing was happening with movies as well. In fact, when I got back into collecting movies a few years ago, I was kind of surprised to see that any brick and mortar retailers were still even carrying movies. I had just assumed, like with what happened with music and CDs and how stores stopped carrying CDs, I just assumed the same thing was going to happen with movies as well. So basically, when I see this, when I see someone wigging out about Best Buy not carrying physical media anymore, or a particular Best Buy location not carrying physical media anymore, I'm just not surprised. I've fully expected that for a long time. But the key point here is that doesn't mean physical media is dying. Not at all. Online sales are a big factor. What I found is that a lot of times, if I couldn't get what I wanted at a brick and mortar store, I could usually find it online, and usually cheaper than what the brick and mortar location was selling it for. So online sales and online shopping became very, very appealing to a lot of us collectors. It's cheaper online, and you can get what you want, and you can get it delivered right to your door, right? People love convenience. That's why they love streaming, because it's so convenient. So you can imagine that for people who are into collecting physical media, online sales were going to be very appealing to them. So that's a big way in which physical media has changed in the modern era. It has shifted more to online sales and is not as widely available at mainstream retail outlets these days. And honestly, when you think about it, that just comes with the territory of being a niche market product, which physical media for movies, Blu-rays, 4Ks, they're showing all the hallmarks of being a niche market product at this point, right? Think about it. Think about all the different types of things in this world that people collect. All kinds of niche market products out there that people collect. People collect coins, people collect stamps, or did. People collect baseball cards. Is that still a thing? I don't know. I assume it is. I know there are probably some people out there collecting baseball cards, but it just might not be as popular as it once was. But does that mean that baseball cards are no longer being produced? I don't think so. So when you think about it, people collect all kinds of different things that you have to go to specialty stores for, or that you can only get online, right? Niche market items are a little less mainstream. They can sometimes be a little harder to find, and they're not necessarily sold everywhere that other mainstream products are, right? They're not necessarily widely available. But the bottom line is, if you're a film enthusiast who cares about any films that are even slightly outside the mainstream, or that go just a little bit beyond the few biggest and most popular titles out there, the truth is you're not likely going to be satisfied with the selection of a brick and mortar location alone, right? You're probably going to need to go to a number of different outlets, both like boutiques and online sources, to get all the titles you want. A Best Buy or a Target or a Walmart, if you're a serious collector and a serious film enthusiast with a wide range of tastes, there's no way you're going to find everything you want at these brick and mortar locations anyway, right? So the simple fact that something is no longer available in a mainstream retail outlet is not in itself any kind of a sign that physical media is dying. Again, it's a sign that physical media has changed and shifted in terms of the business model, right? That's to be expected with a niche market like this. Okay, so we've established that just because physical media is not in the stores as much now, and just because it's not selling like it used to 25 years ago, that doesn't mean it's dying. But now I want to move on to some signs that I think are really positive that physical media is actually very much alive and well. And I think the first thing we can look at, the first sign that physical media is doing just fine, is by looking at other forms of physical media, aside from just Blu-rays and 4K discs, right? Other types of physical media, both in music and movies. Let's see how they're still doing and how they're faring in the modern era. And that might give us some clues as to what to expect in the future from 4K and Blu-ray. CDs, for one. Compact discs, right? CDs are still going strong 35, 40 years later. At least that's the argument I'm making. Every band that I'm into, every artist that I'm into, still puts out their newest albums on compact disc. It's far from dead. Now, to someone who's been doing nothing but streaming music for the last 20 years, maybe the CD is dead to that person. but it's certainly not dead to many of us. Now, of course, CDs don't sell like they used to, just like, movies don't sell on physical media like they used to back in the day, but that's to be expected, right? CDs have also become a niche market, but they're certainly not dead by any stretch. CDs are still around and held in high regard among music buffs like myself because, like with movies, physical media still offers the best possible quality and listening experience. Short of going to like a high resolution digital audio, CDs still give us the best sound relative to the highly compressed MP3 quality of like Spotify or Amazon Prime Music or YouTube Music, right? CDs still give us the best sound quality. Now, I don't collect CDs nearly as much as I used to, but I still buy them. Last year, I bought a few. I bought the new Tears for Fears album on CD. Came out just last year, 2022, right? I also bought the new Simple Minds album on CD, right? And it's not just older artists, too. It's newer artists, too. There's a band I like, or when I say newer artists, what I mean is any artist that came out in the last 20 years. That's what I consider new. But even more contemporary bands, like a band like Mariana's Trench, they're still releasing stuff on CD. They've got their last album, Phantoms. They've released all their albums on CDs. The Cure, you guys may have seen me wear my Cure shirts. They just remastered their Wish album last year and released this in this beautiful 3 CD pack. The gatefold opens up. I mean, CDs are still very much alive, and they are the choice for people who are really into music like me. What about DVDs, right? You remember these things? Yeah, DVDs like Quicksilver here, or these are just, visual aids here. But what about DVDs, right? Are DVDs still around? Are they still going strong? I would say they are definitely going strong. As evidenced by the fact that they still account for like 50, 60+% of all physical media sales in the 2020s. I mean, that's mind-boggling to me, considering the poor quality of DVD. I mean, check out this Media Plays News stats from just this last week. They're still accounting for more than 60% of physical media sales. You go into any Walmart and you know what you'll find? Very little 4K. But yet, they still have plenty of DVDs, whether it's bargain bin or otherwise. And that's because they know that DVDs still sell, and they're still being manufactured. And the DVD format is what, 30 years old at this point? And it's still going strong. Now, of course, it's not what it used to be, but we've already established that, right? That physical media is never going to sell like it did 30 years ago or 20 years ago. There's no doubt that DVD is still going strong at this point. It's certainly not dying as a format, and it doesn't even offer the best quality picture, right? In fact, I came across this article that I think kind of makes that point, and I will link to this in the description. And this is coming from Business Insider, but let me just give you a little teaser here. It says, streaming may be everywhere, but DVDs are far from dead. Here's why collectors stock up on thousands of physical discs, even as film goes digital. So yeah, even DVD is still very much alive and well, even 30 years after the technology was first introduced. And what about vinyl records? They were once pronounced dead, right? At some point? Well, vinyl seems to have made quite the resurgence lately, to the point where many artists are now back to actually releasing their albums on vinyl. It might be like a collector's edition or something like this cool Prince vinyl set that I got, but I just bought this, I think it was about a year and a half ago, and it was just released. Now, I realize it's a little different for Prince because he's passed away, and so, this really slick, limited deluxe collector's edition type deal was certainly to be expected for something like this. This was an album that he had recorded but never released back in, I don't know when the album was recorded, early 2000s, I think. But in any event, Prince's estate released this beautiful package with 2 vinyl albums, a CD of this album, and a Blu-ray of a full concert from 2011. And you can only get that live Blu-ray in this set. But yeah, vinyl's still very much doing well. And it's not just Prince, right? I mean, yeah, Prince is big. You would expect Prince to sell and to be pressed on vinyl. But even contemporary artists like Taylor Swift are putting out their albums on vinyl as special collector's editions. Vinyl is actually pretty hip right now. And when you think about it, vinyl has been going strong for like 70 years. That's when we first got the first vinyl records appeared about 70 years ago. And if you want to go back even further than that, to the first records, which were like 78 records that I think they were made out of like rubber or something, those are more than 125 years old. The first record was more than 125 years old. And here we are in 2023, still talking about vinyl records and Taylor Swift releasing her last album on vinyl. So, vinyl seems to be doing quite well. It's certainly not dead. I mean, even VHS tapes and audio cassette tapes are making a comeback. Now that's not something I thought I'd ever see, right? So is that really what we would expect to see? All these different physical media formats still thriving, still doing well, still going strong? If physical media was really dying? I don't think so. By the way, if you're enjoying the content, please do me a favor and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you can be alerted when I post videos that you like or are interested in. Also, don't forget to hit the thumbs up and like those videos as well. It really helps out the channel. Thanks so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Another sign that physical media is doing just fine is the 4K format, which is actually growing. Last year, we had more 4K titles released than ever before in any other single year, and the sales were on fire, especially during the second half of last year. Now, I've seen a number of people out there kind of look at these sales figures for 4K during the first few months of this year and kind of say, it's not looking so good, because the sales figures were around, about 5%, 5-6%, somewhere around then. And that's historically what we've seen with 4K. But people forget that 4K was on fire for pretty much the second half of the year last year. We got a flood of titles, of great titles last fall. And I can even remember we were making jokes about us. A lot of us in the physical media community were making jokes about how hard the fall was going to be on our wallet, because there were just so many new 4K releases coming out that were good movies that were in demand and highly sought after. So it was a great time for 4K last fall. Let's take a look at the Media Play News stats one more time. And you can see that during the last week, 4K accounted for about 14% of sales, almost a 10% increase over its historic 5 or 6%, right? The week before, it was like 11% of the market share. And the week before that, 4K was about 15% of the market share. So while 15% of physical media sales doesn't seem like a lot, when you consider that 4K started out only having about 5% of the market share, for it to get above 10 or 15 or even 20%, that's pretty big news. And it's certainly an indicator of growth, right? Last fall, we got up to as high as 25% for 4K sales. That was right after Top Gun Maverick had been released, and everybody was grabbing that. I tend to think that 4K sales do better when there are a lot of popular titles being released, right? Now, this year, these first few months of this year, we've gotten some decent 4K titles, but not nearly as many as we got during the last half of last year. So I think that's part of why 4K sales have dipped a little bit in the first part of this year. Plus, I also think that people spent so much money on 4K discs during the last few months of last year that, as you would expect with most retail sales, they're taking a break after the beginning of the year, right? Most retail sales drop during the beginning of the year. But as more and more 4K titles are released throughout this year, I would expect to see a similar situation as what we saw in the last half of last year, as higher profile titles are released in the second half of the year. We've got some big ones coming out, right? The James Cameron films, easily just as big, if not bigger, than Top Gun Maverick. Plus, not just Avatar: Way of Water, but the first Avatar, and we're supposed to get The Abyss and True Lies and Titanic on 4K as well. If we get all of these titles, all these James Cameron titles released on 4K this year, whoa, we're going to see a flood of 4K sales. I wouldn't be surprised if we see it get up to 25–30% of the market share again this year as we get into the fall months and get closer and closer to Christmas. So I would argue that the 4K format as a whole is on the rise right now. It's growing. It's got an upward trajectory. There may be some dips in certain months if we have a month or two with some titles that people aren't quite as excited about. But overall, I think we're seeing a growth trajectory here with 4K. It's certainly not in decline, at least not the way I'm looking at it. We should also remember that a lot of people haven't even upgraded to 4K yet. So there's still a lot of room to grow. Some people may still be using their old TVs that are 10 or 15 years old. And of course, all new TVs these days are going to be 4K TVs, right? So I have this theory that as people naturally upgrade their TVs to 4K TVs over the next, 5–10 years, we're going to see a renewed interest in 4K physical media as well. I mean, that's what happened to me. I took a hiatus from collecting for close to a decade. And what got me excited about collecting again was getting a new TV, was upgrading my TV to 4K and getting a 4K player. Right? It got me excited about movies again. It got me excited about physical media, and it made me want to go back and watch all my old favorites in this new format. And I've also noticed one other thing about 4K sales, and that is anytime we see 4K sales go up in a given month, it usually seems to take from the DVD column. In other words, if we see 4K sales increase by 10% in a given month or week, we'll see DVD sales decrease by roughly the same amount. Well, that tells me that there are a lot of people out there who are making the jump from DVD to 4K. Like maybe they never even got around to upgrading to Blu-ray and they've just still been watching DVDs all these years. But now as they get a new 4K TV, they're getting excited about the new tech. They're taking the plunge and upgrading to 4K. I think we're going to see a lot of that in the next, 5 years, 10 years, somewhere in there. I think we're going to see a lot of growth with the 4K format. A third sign that physical media is very much alive and well is the fact that you still get superior quality on a disc that streaming still can't match, even to this day. Like with CDs, Blu-ray and 4K discs still offer the best possible quality and experience. Short of going to something like Kaleidoscape, which is like thousands of dollars to get into it, and really too cost prohibitive, I think, for most people to be able to go down that road. You're not going to get the output bit rates from streaming that you can get from a disc, right? Streaming, what are the streaming bit rates? They go anywhere from 15 megabits per second to like up to 25 to 40 megabits per second. I think Apple TV is the best quality of streaming, right? And their highest bit rate I think they do is like 40 megabits per second, right? Compare that to a 4K disc where you can get an output bit rate of up to 128 megabits per second. And it's not uncommon to have an average bit rate of like 70, 80, 90 megabits per second. So yeah, by the numbers, you're getting a better quality from physical media, from 4K physical media, than you could ever get on streaming, at least for the foreseeable future. And as long as discs still offer the best quality, physical media is not going anywhere. A fourth sign that physical media is doing great is the explosion of boutique studios and labels in recent years that are catering to all these physical media collectors. Now, I didn't even know this until fairly recently, but there are hundreds and hundreds of boutique labels out there that exist. I'm not even familiar with them all, right? I'm familiar with the big ones like Vinegar Syndrome or Arrow, Kino Lorber, Blue Underground, Criterion, Shout and Scream Factory, right? I mean, if we even consider Scream Factory a boutique anymore, they've gotten pretty big. But I'm hip to like the big boutiques, right? But there are tons of boutique labels I've never even heard of and haven't bought anything from. And we've really seen a lot of growth, I think, in recent years with boutiques popping up all over the place to try and service the demand for physical media. It's a great situation for everyone involved. It's a win-win for everyone involved. Major studios will license out titles to boutique labels for distribution. The boutiques often take on all the restoration work themselves, and they're willing to tackle films that studios either deem too risky or otherwise don't want to spend the money to restore. This works out great for the studios, right? The major studios, because they can just sit back and collect a cut from the sales from the boutique sales. But it also works out really well for collectors because boutiques are more likely to put a lot more care and love into a release than a major studio is going to. And so, of course, collectors love boutiques for this reason. We get a lot of cool collectible editions from boutiques. I just think the boutiques are another indication that in the modern era, physical media has become a niche collectible market. It's no longer for the masses like it once was. And in fact, I view the situation with boutiques as an indicator that we actually have not just a physical media market that's not dying, but we actually have a very vibrant and healthy physical media market right now. And I think, like I said, the boutiques are an indication of this. I mean, if you look at Vinegar Syndrome, for example, and all the great work that they're doing, Vinegar Syndrome's doing really well right now. They've been at it for 10 years and just celebrated their 10-year anniversary. And they're having their best year ever in terms of sales and growth right now. At least that's my understanding. They're releasing bigger titles than they've ever released before. And they're really just on fire right now. So, I think that's a sign of a healthy physical media market. And they're not the only boutique that's doing well right now. I point them out because they are such a success story right now. Now, one last sign that I think physical media is not dying, and this is really more of a theory of mine, and that is, I think the situation with streaming is actually driving some people to physical media, right? I think streaming is starting to piss some people off. It's causing them to rethink what they've been doing with streaming and causing them to maybe think about taking the plunge into physical media. And there are a few reasons why I think the streaming situation is starting to alienate people. First of all, in the early days of streaming, almost all the movies were like on one or two services, right? Wasn't everything pretty much on Netflix and maybe Amazon Prime? I think that was basically it. It was Netflix and Amazon Prime. And studios would license out their movies to these streaming services. So you could find, like if you wanted to watch a movie, like most of the movies were all located in just a couple key places, right? But now that's changed, and every studio is in the game with their own specific streaming service for their own titles and their own separate monthly fee. It's become a very fragmented situation, right? Where you have to pay for like 5 or 10 different streaming services just to make sure all your bases are covered. And when you have that many streaming services that you're now subscribed to, it can actually be a little bit challenging trying to find specific titles and figure out which one of the 10 services you're subscribed to might have the movie you're looking for on a given night. So I think streaming's starting to become a bit of a pain in the ass for people. Seriously. And physical media begins to look a lot more attractive, especially when you consider that you're getting better quality than streaming with physical media. Another problem with streaming, I think, is that, I think companies are finding out that streaming isn't necessarily the best business model if you're looking to grow and make a good profit, right? We've seen some streaming services having to raise their prices to remain viable, or go to ad-supported models, which is really pretty lame when you think about it. I mean, isn't the whole point of going to streaming, of using a streaming service so you don't have to watch commercials like you did on cable TV? Nah, I don't get that. But the problem with streaming is that you're always going to be capped out on the subscription fee, right? The most you can ever make from any one individual is that subscription fee. If you put all your eggs in the streaming basket and don't focus on physical media at all, you're severely limiting how much money you can make, which, is pretty dumb when you think about it. So the problem with the streaming business model is that it's got natural limitations to its own growth built into the model. The only thing these companies can really do is raise prices. And that never goes over very well with most people. So what we're seeing is prices are going up on these streaming services. The amount of content that they're providing on any one service is a lot less than it used to be back in the early days of streaming. So essentially with streaming, we're now paying more than ever before for less content and fewer choices from each service. That's not a good sign. And if I were some of these companies, I'd be very nervous about the future of streaming. Cutting the cord used to actually mean something, right? But now the streaming situation is really no better than the situation with most cable or satellite TV services. And I think people are noticing. Of course, the other big issue with streaming is the censorship issue and companies censoring art. Not cool. The most recent example that's been in the headlines lately is the French Connection, and I guess the Criterion channel has the French Connection. I haven't seen the stream, but apparently they cut about 9 seconds out of one scene in the French Connection. Now I suspect that's Disney, not Criterion. I'll be honest, Disney's kind of on my shit list, guys. I am not a fan of Disney these days. I think this censorship thing is really bad news. And it's a very, very slippery slope. If we continue to go down this road, we're going to be erasing our history. Look, let me give it to you straight here. Censoring art is despicable. It is. It's totally despicable, and it's not going over well with people. And I think it's the kind of thing where it's driving people to physical media. I mean, the sales for the French Connection in the wake of this news about Disney or Criterion or whoever censoring it, the sales for the French Connection on Blu-ray shot way up. People are realizing that they can no longer rely on streaming services to present the films the way they were originally meant to be seen, uncensored and unedited. It's hard not to think that these companies just don't give a damn about the art. Essentially, it's a trust issue. And when you lose people's trust, they look for alternatives. In this case, physical media. I mean, it's important to keep in mind that streaming services can yank titles from their platforms at any time, regardless of whether or not you bought the title digitally or not. You don't own anything with streaming, even if you buy the title digitally, right? Essentially, when you buy a title digitally, what you're doing is buying a lifetime rental license for as long as the streaming service in question decides to carry that movie or that title. It's important to understand that these streaming services are not obligated to continue carrying the titles that they carry. You're really at the mercy of what they decide to do. And I think they even say that in the fine print when you go to buy a movie digitally. It tells you that, they reserve the right, somewhere in the fine print, I think it tells you that they reserve the right to remove this from the service at any time. So I think all of these issues and factors with streaming are driving more and more people to pursue physical media collections. I think some people are realizing that streaming is just not all it's cracked up to be. Now, is the streaming bubble bursting? No, it's not bursting because the masses are streaming, right? The masses are streaming. So as long as the masses are streaming, I don't see this bubble bursting. But I do think the streaming bubble is starting to be deflated a little bit. Streaming has turned out to not be a very profitable endeavor. And we're even seeing indications from CEOs like Bob Iger at Disney that these companies may be looking at going back to physical media, what Bob Iger called, I believe, legacy media or legacy forms of distribution. So I think even some studio CEOs are seeing that it was never a wise idea to put all their eggs in the streaming basket. I came across this article recently talking specifically about the streaming bubble bursting and how it's not quite as viable as people thought it was going to be. And in fact, let me read just a quick little thing here on that. The title of the article is "The Year the Streaming Bubble Burst," and the short version is this: 2022 was a year that undermined some of the core assumptions driving Hollywood's digital revolution, and one that made it clear that the salad days of streaming are firmly behind us. Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement. But it's an indicator that streaming is just not all it's cracked up to be, and that many people have prematurely invested in streaming without really thinking it through. So I think we're seeing a lot of signs that physical media is not going anywhere. It is, it's going to be with us, I think, for a long, long time. So summing up, my view is that, like I said, physical media is far from dying. It's not dying at all. It's just changing and adapting to our modern world. We're always going to have collectors, like I said, and as long as there are people willing to pay, there will be companies out there who are willing to provide physical media for those collectors. So I don't think physical media is going anywhere. But because it has become such a niche product, I do think we can expect to see some changes. I think we can expect to see prices continue to rise over time on physical media, which, that happens with niche products, as well as physical media being more limited and catering more and more to the serious collectors the further we go down this road, and a lot less to the average casual consumer. Because the average casual consumer, they're not the ones buying physical media. We are the collectors, the serious collectors, those of us who are passionate about films, passionate about owning them on disc. We're the ones that the market is for now. I actually think this is a great time to be alive for physical media. In fact, I would take it a step further and suggest that we could even see a bit of a resurgence for physical media in the coming years, if we're not already seeing it. Like I said, we're never going to get back to the kind of physical media sales that we had before the streaming era ever came along. Back then, companies were, producing hundreds of thousands of units for a title, where now it's like maybe 10, 20,000 copies, I'm guessing. So yeah, a lot has changed, but niche does not mean dead. Niche means just that, niche. And I do think there's still a lot of room to grow with physical media, even with the modern constraints of the streaming era. And I say this especially with regard to the 4K format, which I think is doing really well right now. You're going to see more people getting into 4K as more and more people upgrade their TVs over time. And sometimes it can take a while for that upgrade to happen. People aren't necessarily jumping on the latest and greatest TV and upgrading every couple years or anything like that. Most people try to get as much mileage out of their TVs as they can before they have to upgrade. So sometimes it can take people a long time to upgrade to that new format, maybe like 10 years. 10 years is not uncommon. So in many ways, I feel like the 4K format is still just getting warmed up. I certainly don't think it's peaked by any stretch. And I think we're going to see a lot more growth with the 4K format in the coming years. So that about wraps it up as to why I don't think physical media is dying or even close to being dead. I think it's just become a niche market. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Please feel free to leave your thoughts and feedback in the comments section below. I love to read your comments, and I like to hear from you. And so if you agree with me or disagree with me, either way, feel free to weigh in. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.